Okay, hi everyone. So today I'm going to be going through one of what I personally believe is one of the most important teaching and learning strategies, and that's one-on-one instruction. Now, the reason I personally think it's one of the most important strategies, probably in the top 10 or 15 or so out of the 150 that I generally talk about quite regularly. The reason I think that it's probably in that top 10 to 15, maybe top 20, is because of the sheer volume of time that as education professionals we're engaged in some type of one-on-one instruction. So whether you're working with adults or whether you're working with kids, you're generally going to be doing one-on-one instruction quite regularly. Now, it isn't a strategy that you'll find in textbooks or online, unless you read my blogs, of course. It's generally not considered or not spoken about as if it is a strategy per se, in a similar vein to how scaffolding, modelling, metacognitive skills, all these types of things are spoken about. But I think for the reason I've just outlined, it is super important. And if there are any tasks or activities that we do in the workplace or as we're educating people, and we do them to such an extent that it takes up half of our time, then we should really stop and consider what best practice looks like and come up with some rules or some guidelines around that. And then we can add in more strategies, manipulate those rules, and at least use it as a baseline to consider if we're doing things in the best way. Okay, so one-on-one instruction has been thought of in the past. I'm not the first one to think of one-on-one instruction or tutoring or individualized instruction as an actual strategy per se. There is quite a famous author and researcher by the name of Bloom, and his graduate students published a paper in 1984 talking about what is known now the 2 sigma problem. Now, I won't go into what sigma means, but that is interesting reading if you would like to go and have a look at that, particularly if you enjoy the maths and numbers and things. But basically, what that very little known problem, by the way, very rarely do I ever see this. I've never seen it at a conference or a seminar or at any academic paper. Other than that one, I've never heard of this or seen it before. So it's really not something, personally, I think it's by and large been ignored. And basically what this problem says is that students who engage in one-on-one instruction, so let's say, I don't think they specify in their article, but assuming students do, or a student does one-on-one instruction with a tutor or with a teacher or whoever for a couple of hours a week or 2 or 3 hours a week over a period of time, then that student will have unbelievably amazing results in terms of their academic progress and their motivation and self-esteem and concept understanding, knowledge understanding, amount of knowledge, and so on and so forth, to the point where the average student becomes or scores around about the top 2 or 3% in their class or in their school type of thing. So broadly speaking, you take an average student and they become quite proficient at that particular topic via one-on-one instruction. And the 2 sigma problem, even though it's really not well known, and I think it should be well known, and obviously there's a lot of controversy around these types of things, the 2 sigma problem really asks, or what it does ask, is what is it about one-on-one instruction that makes it so effective that, and how can we take that and then use it when we're working on a class of students or a class of say 32 students or whatnot. So I think that's a really important question and something that I've been thinking about for quite some time, and quite regularly I've wondered why no one's really come up with an answer to that problem. And I've got some ideas that I'll run through. I don't think there is a single answer, and I think that's why it's an area that hasn't really received much attention at all. So when I first read about that 2 sigma problem a couple of years ago, I thought it really stood out to me as being important, particularly as it applies to one-on-one instruction, and particularly because I like to teach one-on-one instruction as an actual strategy. And this will start to make more sense as we go through the process of the treatment loop and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's the 2 sigma problem. Please, I recommend looking that up. And just as another thing, there is another little mathematical thing, I guess you could call it, called effect size. Now, effect size is basically a way of measuring how effective something is compared to the mean or compared to a base sort of level. So in terms of one-on-one instruction, I think from memory it was Bloom, it might have been someone else who first said that the effect size of one-on-one instruction, from memory, I'm making this up, from memory I think it was 2.2. So that doesn't mean that it's 2.2 times as good as if you did nothing, but it does, mathematically it means 2.2 is just, I guess think of it just like a number. But that's one of the highest effect sizes that you can pretty much get. Most other strategies, such as the questioning skills, I think from memory that's say 1.2, something like that. Changing class sizes, so going from 20 students or 30 students in a class to 20 has an effect size of something like 0.1 or something like that, so it's quite low. And some effect sizes are negative, so ADHD has a negative effect size of around minus 0.1 or maybe more than that, minus 0.8 or something. It was something quite high. Don't quote me on those numbers, but you can look that up anyway and you see the different effect sizes. And so the point is that effect size, according to Bloom, for one-on-one instruction was really high. Now, a lot of the academics who do research on effect size have gone down the road of landing it at around about 0.4 to 0.8 for individualized instruction, but I'm just not convinced that that's accurate. I think sometimes people do research and they set about not purposely manipulating the results, but I think there are certain political and other reasons why people want different types of effects to be higher, and that's borne out in the types of research. Because for me, they generally say, I think it's around the 0.3. If an effect isn't above 0.3, then it's no different than not using it, compared to putting a student in class and just going through the normal teaching and learning processes with an average type of teacher. So that doesn't mean you ignore those lower effect sizes. But anyway, so originally there was the 2 sigma problem, which is why are students who do one-on-one instruction so much more effective? And then that's led to a lot of research, such as researchers by the name of Hattie, who is really well known in this area. He's an Australian, I think University of New South Wales. And there's another guy in America who, before Hattie, did a lot of work, or around about the same time as well, who's relatively well known for effect size. So they've both got books out that are definitely worth a read, even though it's a little bit older. Effect size, by the way, is very controversial. So because what you're basically doing is comparing different studies that sometimes come from different schools. So you'll have a school in a regional area compared to a school in a city area, and you're sort of combining those to come up with a sort of number. So you can see there's lots of different reasons why effect size is a little bit of a problem, but it does give us a fair idea about what's at the top of the list. So for example, when teachers set about predicting students' grades, there's a strong correlation between what teachers predict and how they treat students and how they put those expectations in place, and students come to meet those expectations. So that has an effect size. It's one of the highest effect size. Teacher efficacy, according to Hattie anyway, is the number 1 on his list out of about 200 or whatever it is 250 things. So that teacher efficacy is the teacher's abilities and beliefs and self-esteem, and this applies to teacher aides and trainers as well, that they know what they're doing and that they're actively putting in a range of teaching strategies and learning strategies and using metacognitive skills and teaching cognitive processes to students and all those other little things, all the things that I talk about in a lot of my videos. has a significant effect on student achievement. So all these things are about student achievement. All these effect sizes, are about student achievement and how we can help students improve and go from point A to point B, which is particularly relevant in a developmental curriculum. Okay, so I won't go on more about that. Where's my thing? But certainly have a look at effect size and that 2 sigma problem. But basically what I just wanted to outline quickly is that one-on-one instruction is very effective, and there are some various different reasons for that we should really be looking at. Now, one of the reasons it's effective is because of attention. Let's just have a look at the reasons right first. So attention, obviously with one-on-one instruction, one teacher is going to give their full attention to a student for a long period of time, or for a sustained period of time. And just as a little side note, by the way, I generally say that one-on-one instruction is up to 3 students. Quite often I like to say 3.5 because, but anywhere up to 3 students, which is a bit of a contradiction in terms, but if you're working with a group, if you're working with 3 students who all have the same problem or same issues, it doesn't really matter if you're working with 3 students or a single student or 2 students or whatever. And generally of those 3 students, you're going to be helping 1 student and the other 2 might just be hitching a ride type of thing and just using that as a bit of a distraction or maybe as a review or whatnot. Or quite often you'll have 2 or 3 students with the exact same problem. So it's a little bit more rare that you're going to be doing a small group lesson with 3 students and all 3 students have very separate issues that need addressing that aren't related to each other. I can't see that happening too often. So anywhere up to 3 students is what I would consider relevant to this particular strategy. So if you're teaching 1 student and then suddenly there was a 2nd student who needed your help, you wouldn't just disregard this strategy completely and go on and do something completely different. So anyway, I was just adding that in because someone was asking me about that the other day. So you've got the teachers or teacher aides or trainers or whoever's full attention. That's a really important aspect of one-on-one instruction. There is lots of feedback. So there's this constant feedback loop that happens. Identify gaps, which is another one. Now, what I mean by identify gaps and feedback is that if you're working one-on-one with an individual student as opposed to 1 on 15, you can identify and target that student's issues and gaps and problems or challenges very, very specifically. And I'll go through that in a minute about how to go about diagnosing specifically what issues are. And you simply just don't have the time or ability to do that if you're working with larger groups of students. You can do it as you circulate and you help smaller 1 or 2 students as you're moving around the room. But if you're up the front of a class or you're talking to 12 students, it can be very difficult to identify specific gaps, or at least you're not going to be able to do it as regularly or as specifically as if you're working with a student or 1 or 2 students on a one-on-one sort of basis. And then you can provide feedback, and not only provide, another reason why it's very effective is that you're constantly providing feedback. So you might provide feedback in a 10-minute session, one-on-one session, 32 times or whatever. I just made that up. But the point is it's that constant feedback. So the student can constantly improve questions. So that's on the student's part. So that there are a huge amount of opportunities in a one-on-one instruction model or approach where the student can ask tons of questions specifically to them. So whether that's knowledge-based questions, procedural-based questions, and so on and so forth. Obviously, it's highly targeted, which I guess we've already spoken about in those types of things. But by targeting it, you can also do metacognitive skills. And please watch my video on metacognitive skills. I talk about them a lot because they are super duper important. Otherwise, students just will figure out how to do a particular question, but then they won't have the concept understanding to be able to apply that in a similar but different context. So it's important to teach those metacognitive skills. There's different, I just use the broad term metacognitive skills, probably just out of habit, but there are different, there's one called, I think, if you were looking at doing some research, I think it's cognitive processes from memory. Which basically I just consider that to all be the same thing, because there is technically cognitive skills, which is different from metacognitive skills. You're working with disabilities and disorders. There's also executive functioning skills. So all these things are slightly different. I just use that broad term, probably incorrectly, but that's just what I do for simplicity. Cognitive processes, they're sort of related like that. So I'll go through some examples of this later, because that's very important in terms of identifying the specific gaps. I'll just write SP, specific gaps in students' knowledge. Okay, we can do strategies. So another advantage of doing one-on-one instruction is that you can implement lots of different strategies, specifically targeted to the needs of that actual student. And I'm running out of room, so I'm just going to write probably one more. Yeah. Which is goals. Now, you'll see that when I go through the next little section that setting goals for an individual student is really important. I've done some videos on goal setting and those types of things. When you start working with a student one-on-one, the first thing you do is try and figure out not only what the problem is, but what the specific goal is for this little session, so that the student can then recognise or understand that they've achieved what they set out to achieve for that particular activity. So if a student is struggling to understand a particular concept, say, I don't know, Venn diagrams or whatever, that seems to be the example I use quite regularly. If they can't understand the basics of Venn diagrams, then quite clearly with these you can outline specifically what the goal is for that student. Because if you've watched my differentiation video, you'll see that we aim a lesson to the masses, as into the middle, probably 50-60% of students, and then you differentiate out there in the two different directions. Most people tend to differentiate to those that need more help, but I actually think that there's ethical and moral problems with that, particularly given that we work in a developmental curriculum, which means all students, every student has the right to your attention and to your teaching expertise and so on and so forth. So I like to say that you differentiate in two directions, not just in one direction, and that's in the direction of those that need help, then that's in the direction of those that also are the higher flyers who you may not think you need help, but they still have the right to continually improve as well. So just bear that in mind. Now, setting goals, obviously talking about effect size, setting goals, various different ways of doing that, such as predicting students' grades or having a high achieving atmosphere, an atmosphere that where there's an expectation of high achievement, does have a really, really high effect size. But that's just sort of by the by, I guess. Okay, so the purpose of going through all this so far, and I know I'm rambling a little bit, is to show that if students are struggling or if they do need help, one of the most effective things that you can do, ignoring all the controversies around all the maths of that kind of stuff, the most effective thing that you can do to help a student in almost all cases is one-on-one instruction, whether that's, and that's why the remedial and intervention type programs or strategies, which I've also done a video on, please go and watch that because it is heavily related to this. Remedial programs are almost always one-on-one. Sometimes, quite often actually, it will be 3 or 4 students, because one-on-one can be quite intimidating for students, especially those that are struggling with core skills like reading and writing and things. But the point is that this should be your go-to strategy, your go-to broad approach when students are really struggling, when you identify 2 or 3 students are struggling. So let's just run a scenario by here. If you're say a teacher aide, you're working in a class and there's 2 or 3 students who you notice for this particular lesson that they're really struggling, then one thing that you can do is talk to your teacher, and this can be the reverse as well, so the teacher can request that the teacher aide or teacher assistant or whoever go through the process of doing some one-on-one instruction specifically with a group of students. Now, in that particular instance, my recommendation, I always recommend this because at the university level, teachers are not taught how to manage teacher aid. So I always say that teachers are good managers of children, but they're useless managers of people. And so, useless manager of adults anyway. So it's important to open those lines of communication and to really strategically think about what you want to achieve for that particular lesson. If you're in a standard primary school class and you've got a teacher aide that's there specifically to work with a student who has autism, you won't be working with that student for 100% of the lesson, because you want them to work in a pair to develop those social skills. You want them to work individually to develop that sense or that ability to be able to achieve on their own, to be able to work independently. So while they will be your main focus, you will also be circulating and helping out other students as well. So that's where the conversation between the teacher and the teacher aide is really important, to try and figure out where you want to devote your time. Should you just equally spread your time out amongst all 30 students in the class, or there are specific areas to concentrate on? And almost always it's a combination. So you might quickly circulate, but then there are specific students who do need assistance so that they can catch up or whatever. So have that conversation as regularly as you can, bearing in mind that what I was saying before about differentiation. So there's a tendency to always just help the students who need help or who are falling behind, but sometimes you can help them too much and you're not necessarily going to help them improve. Even with one-on-one instruction, you will help them improve, but 10 or 15 minutes with a couple of students who need a lot of help is probably more than enough per lesson. And then 10 or 15 minutes with some other students who might be those middle grounders, who are the ones that are typically ignored by teachers and teacher aides, because we tend to naturally want to help those who are struggling. Sometimes, though, we'll set activities for those who are doing are the higher flyers, and the ones in the middle can quite often get ignored. So just bear that in mind from, an ethical point of view. Start thinking about how you distribute your time, particularly in a developmental curriculum. So anyway, that is the reason, or some of the reasons, for why for why one-on-one instruction is so effective. So what I like to use is what I call the one-on-one instruction. I'll use the same colour pen. I like to call it the treatment loop. Now, the one-on-one instruction treatment loop is just something I've concocted to help particularly teacher aides when they're working one-on-one, but also teachers and trainers, so that you can think through the approach that you use when you're helping students in that one-on-one situation. Because the question from a practical perspective goes like this. The teacher says to a teacher aide, please go and help those 3 students over there. Now, what do you do? What does that actually look like? What is the process there? And I think that there are a lot of strategies that I go through in videos and whatnot that you could implement. So you could do some scaffolding and whatnot. But I think there needs to be a stock standard sort of procedure there as a fallback to really help us to optimize that time. Because sometimes you will help a student for 2 minutes. Now, what is the best way to use up that 2-minute time period? If you've only got 2 minutes to help this student, what is the most effective use of that 2 minutes, given that that could be the only one-on-one time that student receives for 2 weeks? So how do you help that student? Because then you've got to help that student for 2 minutes, and that student for 6 minutes, that student for 5 minutes. One-on-one instruction isn't always tutoring. So it's not always after-school tutoring or at recess or whatever, before school or whatnot. It can be that, and I think this treatment loop that I talk about is a broad-based procedure or process that can be used. But it's also important to bear in mind how you would apply this for 2 minutes, or how you would apply it for 20 minutes, and so on and so forth. So now, the first thing that you do in this treatment loop, and actually just one thing, I guess I use a little bit of, I wouldn't say medical terminology, but yeah, we'll go with that, medical terminology, because I think it's important to see this will make sense when I talk about the first one, which is diagnosis. Now, it's really important that, I guess as an analogy or as a metaphor, it's really important for me that we're thinking about the reasons behind why we're helping students in a one-on-one situation. And we're usually helping them in a one-on-one situation because there is a problem that needs treating. So I've gone with a bit of a medical analogy here that I think is quite effective because you can relate that to, I guess, not only a professional sort of way of approaching it, but anyway, yeah, it's a good analogy. I don't know what I'm trying to say there. So one diagnosis basically means we're trying to figure out specifically what is the problem, specifically what is going wrong. And that's one of the most important aspects of this sort of process and something that we don't do very often, to be frank. A lot of teachers, teacher aides, don't go through this diagnostic process as in-depth as they really should, or if at all. And let me give you a quick example of what I mean. So let's assume this is a really important concept. Let's assume students are learning how to do trend lines on a graph. Relatively simple. Where am I going to have room to do this? So basically, you've got a little sort of graph there. And then here you've got your data points. There, your data points. Underneath, you've got a title of sorts. Well, you don't have a title of sorts, you have a title. Down the side, you've got another title. Right, so you've got a title there, title there. One will usually be time. So quite often, I think the bottom line is usually time. And that line there could be, you know, anything. It could be accumulation of waste in a river or something like that. There's a million different things that could be. It could be value of different shares over time or something, who knows. Anyway, and you want students to be able to draw a trend line. So they have to average all those things and to be able to draw that trend line there to kind of predict what's going to happen at this point in time. So at that point in time, the value will be, say, there, something like that. Relatively simple. That's all you want them to be able to do. You're not giving them difficult problems around that or anything. You will sometime in the future. Now, to be able to do that, you'd notice that I just went through, let's say, 6 different processes, right? And one of the things that I say in a lot of these videos is that even the most simple things, such as doing a little graph like that, and you would have seen those graphs around the place for various different things, may seem very, very simple to us, but in actual fact, when you divide it up into little steps, there are lots of little steps that you can go through. And that happens even if you're writing a sentence or if you're doing, I always use the example of a Venn diagram. So you're doing a simple Venn diagram of sorts and trying to put a value in the middle there and some values here and some values there. Even the most basic activities or concepts can still be divided up into lots of different steps. There's another video I've got about chunking, so have a look at that as well, which is a slightly different idea, but that's the process, I guess, of dividing a task or dividing some knowledge into various different chunks to make it a little bit easier to approach. Okay, so in this particular instance, there were 6 different processes that we went through there. So when a student comes to you and says, or you go to a student and you say, how's it going? And they say, I cannot do this, and they're getting all 10 of them wrong. The first thing you need to do is figure out specifically what it is that is happening. Don't make the assumption that, well, they just can't do the graphs because they're not listening or because they don't understand maths and so on and so forth. It'll be one aspect of that they don't understand. Now, teachers fall for this trap all the time. Teacher aides do, trainers in the adult sector. Don't make the assumption that because students get a question wrong, they don't know anything. There's another concept that I've also got videos about called linking knowledge. I think that we call that, well, let's just call that linking. So you've got existing knowledge linking existing, that's what it is. Sorry, I'm just having a mental breakdown here. Yeah, linking. There's a few different terms for this one, but the one I use is building on existing knowledge. Yeah, building on existing knowledge. Now, what that basically means is that students may already know how to do a bunch of different graphs, or they may understand this. This could be a weight loss thing, or it could be, there's millions of different reasons for why people use graphs and graphics. They may be familiar with titles. They may, tables of information. So if that information was presented in table format, they may understand it. If they're into sport or anything like that, they may have come across lots of different statistics which can easily be graphed. So the point is, very few students will ever come into a class and have no knowledge whatsoever. So what you do is you look at the whole process, divide it up into small little steps, and think about specifically what aspect of those steps is going wrong. So in this one, it will be drawing those lines, axis, I think I might have spelt that wrong, axis, and then you've got title or titles. So you've got 1, 2, and the third title up the top. You've probably got a caption. You will have a caption. So let's say there's a caption down the bottom here, right? And then number 4, you've got your data. So you've got your data points. And number 5, you've got a trend line. So I don't know if you can see that. And then number 6, you've got an interpretation. I'm just number 6, you've got your interpretation. So that's not. I'm not saying that's necessarily the best process there. I just sort of made that up as I went. But you can do that in a million different ways, depending on the age of the student and so on. I'll use a different colour here anyway. So, and you'll normally do this on the fly. If you're talking to a student, as you're going through that process, you'll say, okay, just quickly, what part of this can you do and what part of this can't you do? This is also really important for the students' motivation as well, because if they will feel like if they get something wrong that they've got every aspect of that question wrong, whereas realistically it might only be one little thing. So if you jot down really quickly and say, okay, what aspect of this can you do? Can we do these, draw the axis, and we know the Y and the X or whatever, or maybe we don't even need to know that. Can we do the titles? Yes. Can we do the caption down the bottom? Yeah, that's just 4 or 5 words that says, I don't know, weight loss over time or something like that. And can we do the data points? Yeah, they can probably do that. And you could ask the student, well, can you interpret it? What is this all about? And they'll say, well, it shows that X, Y, Z. That interpretation is probably, let's add another one. Let's do a prediction. Right? Say this is a year 9 thing, or maybe year 6, 7, something. It depends. It could be an intro to more difficult tasks or whatnot. Now, let's say that I'm going to assume that let's skip the trend line for now. Let's say you have a chat to the student and say, okay, well, what does that show? What's going on here? And it shows that over time on this particular diet, all of these different people are in fact losing weight or gaining weight or whatever it is. So they can actually interpret it, so they can explain what's going on, closely related to the caption as well. And the prediction, which is this little thing at the end there, so can they use that graph to make a prediction about what's going to happen or what is likely to happen in the future? So can they do a basic prediction? So that's fine. Now, you may decide that these few things are pretty easy, but it's that prediction where it really is not so much the problem, but this is the direction you want the lesson to go in the future, or say the next half hour or so. You want students to really nail down that prediction and interpretation bit. But for this particular student, where they're actually struggling is the trend line. They can actually do the interpretation and the prediction quite well, even though the actual goal of the lesson is those last 2 things. You assume that they can do most of those. You don't really care about the caption so much because that's more of a English type thing, and we're more along the lines of doing a maths lesson here. So as long as they write something decent in there, it doesn't really matter. And what this student is having problems with is that trend line. So you will then, let's just put a big cross against it. Trend line, diagnosis, trend line. That's the process of diagnosing a specific problem so that you can then move on to the other aspects of this one-on-one instruction treatment loop. Now, assuming you've got, let's say 2 minutes is probably not quite enough. Let's say you've got 12 minutes to help that student. You wouldn't even need 12 minutes, I don't think. Let's say you got 5 minutes to help that student. But realistically, you've only got one little thing that you need to show them anyway, and get them to practice. So I don't think it would take very long at all. Now, the reason why this is important, it doesn't have to take that long. You can do this in your head or you can write it out, whatever you prefer. But the reason that this is important, like I said, is to help students in their motivation and to point out that you can actually do all these different things. You have a lot of existing knowledge that you're bringing with you, and you did actually understand, out of the 7 things, you actually understand 6 out of the 7 things anyway. So you're doing really well. Let's just fill this one little gap and then you'll be fine. This, by the way, is the ability, or sort of related to, I guess, that process. It's not quite a metacognitive skill, but dividing things into procedures and processes is a really important metacognitive skill to teach students, because if you can come up with or teach students that every time they approach a problem, see if you can figure out how to divide it into a process. They come up with a process, then they can apply that to ever more difficult and challenging problems without much help from a person that knows more than them. Or what Bloom, who's the person we were talking about before, I think it was him, talks about, what's going on today? Actually, it wasn't Bloom, sorry. There's another video I've done about the zone of proximal development, which is kind of related to scaffolding in a sense, and a term that has come out of that, or that has been around for 100 years, is known as the MKO, or the more knowledgeable other. So a person who can come up with a procedure themselves doesn't need a more knowledgeable other to help them do things, because they can kind of figure it out quite easily. So they'll know that I can do that, 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 I can do that. The prediction is now where I'm having problems, and if you've gone through and taught them these metacognitive skills to be able to develop processes, the first thing they'll probably do is look at prediction and go, what do I know? What don't I know? How can I find that information out? Or they'll divide that into a few different options, option 1, option 2, option 3, and then they can choose the most likely. Or they might look at whether they can divide that particular task and chunk it down into 2 or 3 other little tasks. So watch that metacognitive skill video, because it's really important, and you can see why teaching that to students is so super effective, because they can then apply, if you teach one metacognitive skill, or the 3 that I just showed you then, they can then apply those 3 metacognitive skills to anything, not just maths, but to science, sport, biology, whatever. Okay, so we'll get moving quite quickly. Now, once you've diagnosed, actually, one other thing, very important. Another thing to bear in mind is that when you are diagnosing students, not only do you need to be highly targeted, but you need to figure out, figuring out specifically where the problem is, but you also need to consider what type of issue is, or what the current issue is in terms of what type of problem is going on. So it could be a concept problem, it could be, or concept understanding. It could be just pure knowledge. I'll explain this in a sec. It could be due to disability. And there's one more that will come to me in a sec. So the student, that's what it was, process. Yeah. So the student can have, let's start down the bottom, because this is where I'm talking about over here. There are various different reasons for why the student has this issue. It could be that there's a process problem, as in they don't understand the procedure. They may understand each of these individually, but they get them mixed up or whatever. So they're trying to interpret it up here when they're doing their caption or whatever. So they may just not understand the process. And by teaching them the process, or showing them what that process is, they can then step it out and do it quite well. So sometimes it's a process problem. Sometimes it's due to a disability or disorder, or particularly a disorder, which is like if there's a neurological issue, if they have an IQ under 70 or whatever it is, they're considered to have a special need. Then it could be that it's not so much any of these other things. It could be that it's just literally an intellect or ability type issue, in which case it might take just longer for them to acquire that knowledge. It's not to say that they can't do it. It might just need to be done over a longer period of time. And some of these areas, like that trend line thing, it may just mean that that's where that student sits for quite some time. So they've hit the limit of their ability as far as being able to work in that particular class, and that extra support and scaffolds and differentiation around that will need to occur. So it could be due to a disability or disorder, particularly a neurological or learning disorder, in this instance anyway, because it's an academic type process. It could be a pure knowledge issue. And this is the easiest one to fix, because the student might just not have the information in their brain that they need to be able to do that particular thing. So if they don't have that piece of knowledge, that fact, that factoid, then they won't be able, they'll get stuck on something. So that's another one. Actually, there's probably one more I'm just going to add. Could be a literacy reason. I'll get to that one in a sec. Or it could be a concept understanding problem. So they may not understand the concept. And if you've watched any of my videos, you know that I harp on about the difference between concept understanding and task completion quite a lot. So task completion, getting 10 questions done is, let's just call this bad practice, compared to getting 3 questions done where students understand the concepts behind the problems in those questions. It's very important to understand the concept for those 3 questions so that they can then go off and apply that concept understanding to other questions the next week, as opposed to just doing 10 questions. And that's what we call surface learning, by the way. Where would I write that? We'll write it over here. Surface learning. I should do a video on that, right? Surface learning basically means that students kind of memorize things, or for however they go about doing it, they get the answers from other people. And they have a broad understanding. No, they don't have that broad understanding of the concepts that underpin what they're doing. All they've done is figure out how to answer this maths problem. But they may come up with an answer for this, but then if you did a different question, or let's say you changed it so the trend line went in the other direction, they won't be able to give you the answer to it. They can only do it in that direction because they've worked out that that means time, that means that goes over time. So, but if you do the inverse, then that throws them completely because they don't have that concept understanding. And I just wrote literacy there because literacy as a barrier to understanding and being able to apply the process can be important, because if you've written out this question in paragraph form, for example, then it could actually be a literacy, or what they call a language. It could be I was going to write LLN, but it's actually probably not the N in this case, but it's a literacy or language problem. It could be a vocab issue. It could be a translation issue if you're dealing with students who have a second language, and so on and so forth. So just bear that one in mind. Sometimes I used to teach year 9. I have to teach high school maths, and for all the different years in high school, one of the big barriers is students reading something. So they're doing an English type or language type task, and trying to pull out all those inputs so that they can then figure out where the data goes, or they can take it from being a worded question to a purely mathematical question. And that, I guess, is what you call numeracy, so the ability to be able to do real life tasks. Anyway, so they're the different types of reasons for why there could be problems. Once you've diagnosed the problem here, the next thing to do is to come up with a specific goal for that student, because sometimes it's just a never-ending thing, right? So it's important to determine, if you're helping a student out for 5 minutes or 60 minutes, that you've got a specific goal for that little session. From there, the next thing after you've done a diagnosis is treatment. So that basically means that you're thinking of the most effective way to go about solving that problem. Now, that can be that you're doing inside a one-on-one instruction type process. That can be that you're just doing a couple of examples first. So you're doing some worked examples or some think alouds where you're going through and showing the student how to do it. You might get them to do a little practice, and so on and so forth. So treatment is the main crux of that one-on-one instruction, where you're helping that particular student out. I won't go on about that anymore. And then the next thing, well, there's various different ways that you could draw this, and every time I draw it, I seem to change what I'm doing. We'll use this one. So you've gone through, you've diagnosed what it is, you've done the treatment, and a part of that treatment, you're giving them some opportunities to practice, and then you're providing them with feedback. Okay, on how they're going. So it's almost like you are actually doing another diagnosis here. So, but what happens is that with this feedback, you're watching them, you're helping them, you're letting them know whether they've achieved their goals or not. Now, sometimes here, and the reason I put this one here is that is where it ends, if you've done your job properly. That is where it can quite often end because you've actually addressed the problem. So if they're having problems with the trend line, you've gone through, you've done some worked examples, you've explained it, you've got them to do some practice. You might do some shared learning type activities where you do part of it, they do part of it. You show them different graphs that they can do. So you might go, okay, so what happens? Let's ignore all this because it doesn't really matter. What happens if I do this? Draw the trend line for that one. Okay, now what happens if I do this one? What's another one? What happens, let's get a bit more tricky. What happens if I do that one? Draw the trend line there. And they may say, well, you can't really do it. It's not possible type of thing. So you're just having these discussions with them. Okay, so you've done some type of treatment there. And now if they then go through and practice, so you say, okay, try this one. Okay, now try this one. So you're doing a little bit of a test there. Then you provide them feedback in one direction or another to either end it, basically end the process is what I mean, to say that, yes, you've achieved those goals that we set out to achieve, and now you understand that. So you should be able to now do 100%. And quite often what you'll do there is say, look, I'll come back in 15 minutes, go on and practice these 10 or 15 things, and then we'll have a chat about them and so on and so forth. So that's that feedback part of it. I'll use my red. Rightio. Now there's a couple of other processes obviously here, depending on how you want to draw it. And again, I do this slightly differently every time I do it. Now, once you've done feedback, if the student still has, I guess, issues and problems, then they will need opportunities to practice. So that basically, quite often that will mean that they're practicing with you. So you're there and you're doing some type of shared learning or guided learning. And that could mean that they're working through 10 or 15 problems, all the same sort of problem with different inputs. So I generally just call that opportunities to practice. And then there is formative assessment. The other thing to bear in mind too, I'll go through that in a sec. The other thing to bear in mind, I've done that slightly differently to how I've done that in my book. These bottom three here can kind of go together. So I wouldn't do these as you do that first, then that, then that. They kind of get jumbled in together in many ways. But depending on the student, making sure that there is that circle there is the most important aspect if it doesn't end. So once you've provided feedback to the student and you've said, okay, we're still having problems here, even though I've treated it. So let's assume, for example, you go to a doctor, you say to a doctor, I've got this particular problem. The doctor says, okay, we're going to treat it this way. And then after, say, a week or so, you go back and see the doctor and say, nope, or let's do, I don't know, this particular blood test or whatever. And then the feedback comes back and goes, yep, it's all good now. And that whole process has finished. Or is it the case that, no, not yet, we're going to continue taking that medication for a little bit longer? So that's where that opportunities to practice fits into that kind of metaphor. And then after a while, there is that additional formative assessment type process. So really, actually, all of this here is a formative assessment process anyway. Now, formative basically means informal assessment. So it means you do the diagnosis, which is a type of formative assessment, as in you're trying to figure out specifically what's going on. You do the treatment, as in, and part of that treatment too, you're constantly trying to figure out whether that light bulb moment has gone off in the student's mind, and then you're providing feedback to them. Feedback's not really a formative assessment, but you're providing feedback based on that treatment there. If it doesn't work, you're then giving them opportunities to practice. So that opportunities to practice, depending on if you've got time, you might end up working with them, as I was saying before, for 10 or 15 minutes. Or alternatively, you might again tell them that you'll come back later with the view to reassess them up here. So in a way, that is a type of treatment. It's another type of treatment, but I guess you're not just repeating that over and over again, because most of the time it should just go like that. And they'll be able to hit that goal relatively, not relatively easily, but at some point during that process. Okay, so that's the one-on-one instruction treatment loop, or the basics of it. Again, there are a couple of different versions of this. And the other thing to bear in mind that it is a loop, right? So if you go through the process and effectively you decide that, okay, we diagnosed it and we did diagnose it accurately. It's important to reconsider that if you get to this point, and you treated it appropriately, and you gave the student appropriate feedback, and then you decided that, well, okay, the feedback was that you still need more practice, but you sort of know, you have the concept and you have the knowledge now or whatever. Now you just need some massed practice or some type of guided practice maybe or whatever, and then we'll reassess. And then you do some type of assessment here. Now sometimes here is where it will end as well. Hopefully it does. But sometimes, in other words, you've had two opportunities at two sort of ends of that loop to end that process, but sometimes you'll get back to the start. If that happens, that means you need to reconsider your diagnosis and certainly reconsider your treatment, because there's no point in just repeating that loop over and over again. Maybe instead of 5 minutes, you need to spend half an hour with them. Maybe they just need some examples that they can go home and practice. You could, with something simple like this, you could easily draw 10 or 15 of those on a piece of paper, and then the student can just go through and practice each one and just draw the trend lines in like that and explain it. They could do a peer learning process. There might be, again, that communication between teacher and teacher aide about whether there's more one-on-one instruction. Because bear in mind, this is a one-on-one instruction loop, so it's not a whole of class type activity. So if that one-on-one instruction doesn't work here, and you get back to diagnosis again, then you may need to consider whether you need more one-on-one instruction or more intensive one-on-one instruction. Maybe you get back to diagnosis and you realise that actually the problem is that the student needs to go into a more intensive one-on-one instruction mode, such as a remedial instruction process, or maybe they tick over to the point of remedial instruction is quite extreme. A remedial program is quite extreme because that's where they're being pulled out of class for support in their core skills. But maybe they fall into the intervention category. So watch my videos on my video on intervention and remedial instruction, because sometimes if you get all the way around, I'd say they probably then fall into that intervention category. Okay, so that's the basics of one-on-one instruction. I hope that makes sense and that it wasn't too confusing. With this loop, the final thing I will say, however, is that it won't apply every single time you're helping a student. And I don't do any of these things or any of these processes so that in a way that means you must do the process exactly as is. Use these tools so that they work for you and adjust it and so on and so forth. But it does give you a good basis or a good foundation in how to approach that one-on-one instruction task. Because remember, before I started talking about treatment loop, the problem was a teacher says to a teacher aide, go and help those 3 students over there, please, because those 1 to 3 students are struggling with graphs. Then what happens? What do you do? So that teacher needs to provide pedagogical advice to that teacher aide in how to go about doing that. Or that teacher needs to have the pedagogical knowledge, as in the knowledge of the teaching strategies and processes, to be able to go over there and have a plan of attack. And I think this gives you something of a means to which approach that particular task, whether it's for 5 minutes, 20 minutes, or 6 hours. You could use something along those lines where you're accurately diagnosing what's going on, you're treating it, you're providing feedback, and then you're going through that reassessment process, whether it's giving them that ability to practice first, and going through a bit of an assessment process here, formative assessment, so informal, and then you're re-diagnosing and following that procedure again if the student still doesn't understand, thinking about whether you diagnosed it wrong or treated it wrong. Now, actually, just one quick thing, and I promise I will wrap this up in about 2 minutes. I've spoken a lot about maths here, and usually my examples I give are maths or English. Now, as an English teacher by trade, not an actual maths teacher, although I did spend half my time in schools teaching maths, let's just do a very, very super quick English type example. Now, one that pops up all the time is reading, and well, let's go with reading. So quite often students get told that they can't read, or teachers or parents believe that they can't read to the level that is expected for that particular age group or whatever. So they'll say, this student struggles with reading. But that's actually not quite correct. In reality, that student doesn't struggle with reading, and it's not necessarily a process problem, but it's usually a knowledge problem, or maybe it's a concept problem. Sometimes there's a bit of delay there, like some type of developmental delay, so it could be they fall into that category. Certainly it's a literacy and language problem. But quite often when people say that that student has problems with reading, they don't actually have problems with reading per se, as a broad category. And if you were to diagnose that as problems with reading, then your treatment isn't going to be accurate, because the actual diagnosis should be more targeted and more specific to that student. And by targeted, I mean it could be that those high utility words is what they have problems with. So the top 200 or so words that we use thousands of times every day, or the top 500. And I think it's something like the top 500 words are used 97% of the time, or something like that. So maybe the student just lacks that knowledge of those top 500, or what they call high utility words. So that could be the issue. It could be an issue with pronunciation. It could be a physical problem with the jaw or something like that. It could be an issue with spelling. It could be an issue with a particular grammatical point. It could be a phonics type problem, their phonological awareness or phonemic awareness. They could have an issue around sounds. There might be 3 or 4 sounds that they just don't quite understand. It could just be a simple spelling problem, so a knowledge issue. So there are various different reasons for why students struggle with reading. It's not, why students struggle with reading. It's not that a student has a reading problem. And the same applies for writing, science, sport, and so on and so forth. Okay, so just bear that in mind, that no matter what subject you're talking about, accurately diagnosing the problem in a very targeted and individualistic way is super important. So I'll wrap that up there. That's 101 instruction. I hope you've learned something from there, and please watch my other videos, and good luck.